So Sean came to me, he said, listen, the guys in Boston, as he always referred to them, want a scary movie. You want to write something scary? And I said, no, I don't know anything about that. And he says, well, you were raised as a fundamentalist. Just pull all the skeletons out of your closet, and sort of laughed at me. So and now that was Last House on the Left.
And was that inspired by Bergman?
Yes, it was.
Released in 1960, Ingmar Bergman's medieval drama film, The Virgin Spring, tells the story of a teenage daughter leaving her parents for a short trip with another woman. Along the way, she happens upon some strangers who rape and kill her before they unknowingly take shelter at her parents' home. Upon learning the truth, the father takes revenge by killing his daughter's aggressors. In 1972, 12 years after The Virgin Spring, the low-budget exploitation horror film, The Last House on the Left, by Wes Craven, hit theaters, with a nearly identical plot to Bergman's aforementioned film. Craven is said to have been inspired, but as far as I am concerned, The Last House on the Left is fundamentally a remake of The Virgin Spring, regardless of a different setting and narrative specifics. Speaking of remakes, 2009 saw the release of The Last House on the Left, directed by Denis Iliadis. This retelling follows a basic plot of the two previously mentioned films, but takes creative liberties in storytelling, with Craven's approval. The man behind Nightmare on Elm Street and Scream may seem hardly similar to the man behind Persona and Wild Strawberries, yet here we can find some undeniable common ground. Spanning half a century, this basic story has been told, retold, and then retold again with the same universal essences, but with enough deviations to reflect not only different cultural sensibilities, but also the changing times as people move further and further away from God and traditional recognitions of authoritative structures. This video aims to explore and synthesize these three separate but related texts for their similarities and differences, in order to establish a dialogue on the nature of adaptation and the evolution of existentialism.
Det är för att kungadöttrar varken behöver tvätta eller elda.
Min bror säger att stadsjungfrun har så fager hals.
De har kungadöttrar för att guldet ska lysa så mycket fagrare.
Min bror säger att stadsjungfrun har så smal midja.
The Virgin Spring stands out in Ingmar Bergman's body of work for its brutal depiction of rape and revenge, and its relationship with religious faith in medieval Sweden. Much of the spiritual conflict depicted in the film mirrors the conflict between Christianity and paganism, battling for cultural dominance during the Middle Ages, as well as the internal conflict between oneself and one's God. The father Tor sets aside his Christian values when he commits murder for revenge, only to plead for God's forgiveness and vow to build a church in honor of him, despite clearly being angry and hurt by what he perceives to be the Christian God's lack of action to protect his daughter from rape and murder.
Gud, du ser det! Det oskyldiga barnets död och min hämnd. Du tillät det. Ändå ber jag dig nu om förlåtelse. Jag vet inget annat sätt att försona mig med mina egna händer. Jag vet inget annat sätt att leva.
This is the paradoxical nature of Tor's faith. Instead of abandoning his faith, he does his best to reaffirm it, despite being given little reason within the story to remain Christian. In fact, the world of the film may be one without God altogether, and faith in God is ultimately faith in nothing. Although the spring that emerges at the end could be a sign of the presence of the Christian God, or it could be incidental. The film also entertains the existence of Odin. Seeing the hex that the hateful Ingeri places on Karin seems to work. though this also may be incidental. Either way, Ingiri blames herself. She would be complicit in the rape and murder, regardless if the hex actually has a practical basis, as she witnessed it and did nothing. At one point, she lifts a stone, yet decides to do nothing with it.
Jag hade tagit en sten för att kasta på dem. Men jag släppte den.
The worship of Odin is framed as a source of evil, even if arguably one with a practical basis in reality. Although to many Christians, paganism itself is a worship of false gods, and so by extension, a worship of Satan, meaning that the film could still be entertaining Christianity as truth, but God is silent when observing the corruption of innocence. The daughter Karen encounters two older men and a boy, and has a picnic, unaware that her alluring charm entices them. It is once they find the frog inside the bread loaves, the hex, that they act out and rape and kill her. This suggests that their actions are something of nature, which in turn is intrinsically tied to paganism. The rape of Karen may represent the loss of purity and innocence, which by extension represents the loss of faith in one's religion. The virgin is violated and ugliness persists. The moment is quiet because God is quiet. We see nature for how it is. And after this moment of violence, nature carries on as if nothing happened. Karen is left for dead among nature, without even receiving a proper burial beneath the earth. The young boy is visibly distraught by the events, and eventually goes sick from his guilt. As Tor seeks revenge against the men, there's a brief moment where he contemplates sparing the boy from the same fate of his brothers, and the boy runs to Karen's mother, who out of her maternal instinct desires to protect him. But ultimately, Tor has his way with him, and he dies alongside the others. Interestingly, Ingiri is spared, despite her confessions of sin. She is arguably more complicit in the crime than the young boy is. Males are thought to be active and aggressive, while females are thought to be more passive and weak. While statistically, women have a higher chance of being victims of sexual violence, that does not necessarily mean they are never complicit in rape culture as well. In this case, the character Ingiri is. Although in some ways, she is also a victim herself. Not long before Karen is raped, a man Ingiri visits makes inappropriate sexual advances towards her, despite her objections.
Men du är rädd. Det ska du inte vara. Jag ska ge dig styrka.
Out of fear, Ingiri runs away and says nothing about the event. But unfortunately, sexual aggression and violence towards women continues to persist throughout the world and the changing times, which in turn calls many to question why it is that God allows for terrible things to happen. That is, if God is real at all.
What do you think, Weasel? K-R-U-G. Krug. That's really nice.
The last house on the left deviates from the Virgin Spring with a few key narrative details. This time around, the two girls, Mary and Phyllis, are friends, and both of them are sexually violated and killed. There was also a woman present in the group of criminals named Sadie, and the role of the child is aged up and assigned to the mentally unstable drug addict, Junior. Under the guise of a drug deal, he is the one to lure the girls into the trap, but he also comes to regret his complicity, and in the end, even threatens to kill his father Krug, only to be pressured into committing suicide.
No, not at me. I want you
gun, and I want you to put it in your mouth. And I want you to blow your brains out. No! Blow your brains out! Blow your...
Here, the scenes of sexual violation are much more exploitative, given the film's cynical juxtaposition of upbeat folk music, mixed with the criminal's laughter towards the girl's humiliation. It's still framed as tragic, of course, but it also serves as a brutal confrontation of repressed, taboo, human interest, of artistic depictions. The criminals get sadistic joy from their violence, while the film's non-diegetic music and editing dissociates the audience from immediate sensitive engagement. Though there is subtle indication that Krug feels dirty and wrong for corrupting the innocent, which is even confirmed by actor David Hess. But the moment of emotional ambivalence only really comes after the fact. In contrast, The Virgin Spring features mostly quiet ambivalence on the rapist's part all the way through, asking the viewer to engage with the scene, similar to how God does, observing in silence. In Last House, we finally see what would happen had the other girl picked up the stone and fought back to save her virgin friend.
Listen, I can help you. I'll get you out of this. You stupid dyke.
Lady! I'm gonna kill you!
And the answer is just as devastating as the alternative. The girl isn't saved.
Kill that bitch.
Instead, their bodies are both physically and sexually violated. While the Virgin Spring sees Karen dying as a result of the assault, Mary's traumatic walk to the water is longer, and it takes a few bullets to the back to end her life.
To guide you, protect you, hold you, and love you.
The act of vengeance is a lengthier process than it is in the Virgin Spring, with the father's physical limitations being exposed, and the mother taking an active part, going so far as to seduce Krug's friend Weasel and then bite off his penis, as his hands are tied behind his back. Krug dies by means of chainsaw, just seconds after the cops show up to the scene of the crime.
Don't, for God's sake, don't!
The film cuts back and forth between Krug's gang engaging in the most vile of crimes, to comedic scenes of the cops walking around like bumbling idiots and making mistakes worthy of write-ups. This gives the film more thematic texture, as the cops come so close to their peripheral crimes, and thus so close to doing something about them. In my opinion, the comedy itself is not exactly funny, and more so serves to make the tragedy all the more horrific, as we have this tonal counterbalance.
Fasten seatbelt!
Proceed, Ada. Now listen, Harry, if you tell any of the boys at the lodge about this, I'm gonna fix your head.
Of course, the cops' place in the narrative represents society's growing distrust and the competence of authority figures, especially following culture's paradigm shift into secularism. The film dares to ask, if society cannot trust God as an authority figure to protect us from harm's way, then how can people be trusted? The answer, according to the film, is they can't, for they are too incompetent, so the parents must take matters into their own hands, even if it challenges their notions of moral rights and wrongs, instilled in them by a Christianized society. But what other options would they have? especially if they exist in a godless world. At a few points, religion and God are both mentioned, but ultimately mocked by the convicts.
What are you doing with the Holy Bible?
Dearly beloved, we are gathered here.
Krug was even locked away for the murders of 2 nuns and a priest, as nothing is sacred to him. The rape and murder of Mary is in many ways emblematic of the death of religious faith, comparable to the Virgin Spring, but ultimately different. While Bergman makes Tor vow to affirm his faith, Craven hints at an outright repudiation of it. This is made explicit through the music during the moments following Mary's sexual assault. David Hess's song comments on loneliness and the nature of God, and reaches a thematic crescendo once the prayer ends, and the lyrics, "And now you're by yourself," are sung.
I pray the Lord my soul to
Now you're by yourself.
This moment posits that God's hand may be upon her and will protect her, but as she is shot dead in the river at the hands of her violent aggressor, and the song ceases, replaced by the sounds of nature, suggests it is people that have control over others, rather than God. Mary's name likely alludes to the Virgin Mary, but she deviates from this likeness given her sexual interest and desire to experiment with recreational drugs, suggesting secularism is taking God's place in society.
Hey, no bra?
Of course not. Nobody wears those anymore.
She also wears a peace sign necklace, rather than something religious. But given what eventually becomes of her, even these liberal humanist symbols, aiming to replace the comfort religion brings, are shown to be fruitless. As the film suggests, reality is much more cruel, whether there is a God or not.
Oh, get that hair out of her mouth. Tell her everything's gonna be okay. Tell her help's on the way. Tell her it's not as bad as it looks. Do it! She needs you!
Denis Iliadis' 2009 remake of The Last House on the Left takes a number of creative liberties in order to shape its own identity as a horror film in the late 2000s, which includes rejecting the more exploitative and low-budget aesthetic and production of its predecessor, in favor of something more sensitive and accessible. Ironically enough, I think this has the downside of making the film less interesting than the other 2 discussed here, but that's not to suggest there isn't something compelling in the film's intertextual dialogue. In this version, Mary is smarter and stronger than the previous iteration, while her friend, now named Paige, is made into the more vulnerable and scared one. The role of the boy in Junior is now attributed to Justin, who has something of a Romeo and Juliet dynamic with Mary. While the boy in Virgin Spring may have only been complicit in the rape and murder by association, Junior actively lures the girls into the situation, only to come to regret it later. In contrast, Justin invites the girls to smoke marijuana with him, unaware that his father and company would return home and abduct the girls.
And we won't say anything to anybody.
Well, I don't know. Frank, you believe him?
Yeah. You know, I think maybe I could.
Justin blames himself and is sickened by the situation that he inadvertently lended a hand in. Rather than being killed alongside the rest, or killing himself, Justin is somewhat rehabilitated by the end of the film. First, by cluing the parents into what happened.
The kid put it there. John, Mary was wearing this when she left. She was wearing this when she left today.
Secondly, by giving them the gun used to shoot their daughter. And thirdly, by standing up to his father, this time by staying alive and fighting for what's right, regardless of the obvious conflict of interest.
I'm not mad, all right? Just don't do anything stupid.
yourself.
The rape scene is played pretty straightforward without a hint of irony or emotional detachment. We see things from Mary and Justin's point of view. For Mary, the horror stems from being raped, while for Justin, it's witnessing the rape and knowing he is in some ways complicit in his family's atrocities.
Justin, please.
Stay right there, Justin.
Some critics actually argue that the remake is more exploitative because the rape is grounded in Hollywood convention, while the more low-budget, experimental depictions of rape and murder found in Craven's film were tailored specifically to call back to the graphic images of the Vietnam War, and thus had a clear identifiable purpose. I don't exactly agree with the remake being more exploitative, largely because of the original film's rather concerning and problematic means of production. Although a fair argument can still be made on what does and does not happen in the remake. Last House 09 drops the bumbling cop side plot and barely makes reference to God and religion altogether, ostensibly suggesting that not only are authority figures too incompetent or unsympathetic to trust, but also they are hardly even worth considering at all. Instead, characters operating in this post-theistic world must take actions into their own hands, as traditional recognitions of good and evil are challenged, though Krug's gang is definitely framed as evil. While the Virgin Spring and original Last House depict revenge as morally ambivalent, Last House 09 frames it as an undeniably just cause, at least according to my best judgment. Something of note is that while rape plays a significant role in the other two films, it is more so the daughter's death that causes the parents to act on revenge. Yet through a drastic narrative change, Last House 09 directs more attention to the rape itself, positing that rape alone justifies, or at least rationalizes, the parents' decision to seek revenge. This is achieved by making Mary survive the gunshots and swim her way home, given her newly attributed status as a competitive swimmer. Fittingly, her parents react more strongly to her getting raped than they do to her being shot, highlighting culture's shift in attitudes towards sexual crimes that were once relatively trivialized.
She was raped.
No. No.
Motherfucker.
Mary living on after the incident grants her agency and individual strength that neither Karen nor the original Mary were ever given. Although, by surviving rape, Mary will continue on in life with trauma continuously lingering over her from what occurred in the woods, even if her aggressors are justifiably punished.
You're gonna be fine.
Wait. Hey. Wait.
Nature, and more specifically, weather, plays a prominent role in Last House 09. It is the storm that leads Krug and company to take refuge at the Collingwoods house. And it is also arguably what incites the parents to enact revenge, seeing that the storm prevents the police from coming to make an arrest, the ambulance from coming to medically assist their daughter, and the convicts from leaving anytime soon. Thematically, the storm also reflects the nature of the situation, brought on by their actions. The moments leading up to the rape and murder attempt are the calm before the storm, and fittingly, the storm lets up as revenge is carried out, as if the sun shines again to remind us the worst is over. By comparing and contrasting The Virgin Spring, The Last House on the Left, and its remake, and then assessing the commonalities and deviations between the text, we will be able to better understand how different artists will approach the same basic subject matter and plot points, and shape them into their own unique works, reflecting not only their personal sensibilities, but also the sensibilities of culture at the given time, in relationship with religion and violence, and how that continues to evolve over time. While these three films may give us an inside look at Sweden and the United States' shift in social attitudes towards these topics over a period of 49 years, this basic story dates even further back. The Virgin Spring is based on a 13th century Swedish ballad, whose title translates to Tor's Daughters in Vänge, which has been retold in different ways throughout various Scandinavian countries over the years. The ballad may or may not also be based on historical truth. So it was fitting that Bergman set the film adaptation in medieval Europe, thereby grounding Tor's actions as being rational for the time. Bergman also took after Akira Kurosawa's 1950 film Rashomon, which showcases different accounts of the murder of a samurai and the rape of his wife in the woods. The humble Bergman actually passed off The Virgin Spring as a wretched imitation of Kurosawa. Whether wretched imitations or not, The Virgin Spring, what influenced it, and what it influenced, connect together in an ongoing international and intertextual dialogue worthy of attention and analysis.
People talk about it being a version of The Virgin Spring.
Yeah, I thought, well, what's a good plot? And I thought The Virgin Spring was such a remarkably concise and tight and ironic story. And I think, by the way, Bergman thought that because it was a centuries-old myth or part of their folklore in his area of the world, that he borrowed it for his movie. So, yeah, I borrowed the basic story outline and the sort of reverse of, the straight and narrow parents, very religious father, turning and becoming quite vicious and, completely beyond the law and taking revenge.
It's a pretty brutal movie.
Yeah, it's quite brutal.
Even as society changes and accepts the brutal reality of our existence, especially in an increasingly secular world, some basic truths of essence remain intact. That is, until they are violated and left for dead. The future of our children may not be the brightest after all, even if God shows their signs. Special thanks to my patrons, Yaka Rajenoi, Pseudo Moron, George, Greg, Adam Young, Matt Harrison, Wolfgang, and Kayla. Thanks for watching. If you like what I do, please like, subscribe, and share my work around. If you'd like to see your name in future videos, consider donating to my Patreon. Bye-bye.
What do you want to be?
Frog.
Yeah, you look like a frog.
If I was a frog, I'd have my own lily pad. I could sit there all day long, just ribbit, ribbit. I could do that, man, and nobody would bother me. I could watch it fly through